In a world where people want to think of themselves as smart, they tend to go with evolution over God because it just sounds so much more intellectual. After all, it's science, right? So if evolution comes up in a conversation, don't spend your time trying to disprove it because that's a losing battle. Most people have been steeped for years and years of education in this, and you're not going to change your thinking over a cup of coffee. Remember that bite-sized answers is not about winning arguments, but winning people. All we want to do is throw out a few thought provoking statements to move that issue to the side to open up an opportunity to share the good news of Jesus. And if they come into a relationship with Christ, that's the game changer. So if that issue were to come up, I'd probably say something like, evolution and Christianity can coexist, but only if evolution will operate as science. You see, science uses a method. It's based on observation, then there's an hypothesis that's created, then there's testing, analysis, and finally a conclusion. But if things are inconclusive, you have to go back and do more testing and more analysis. It might even change your conclusion. You can never start with a conclusion. If you do, that's not science. It has to start with observation. This is what Charles Darwin did back in the early to mid 1800s. He observed and observed and observed. And you know what he observed? Evolution in action. But it's what's called microevolution. Changes taking place within a species, like the bill size of birds and changes going on in insects. The kinds of things, by the way, that are still going on today. But he never observed macroevolution, the transition of one species to another, which assumes that everything comes from a single life source and the changes and changes take and species come up and it just keeps on moving. He said, that'd be no problem because the fossil record over time will validate this. But now 175 years and a quarter of a million fossils later, there's still not a single transitional fossil. At times they think they found one, but over time it gets disproven. Science is good when it operates as science, but when it tries to move into philosophy and promoting theories as facts without observation and hypothesis and testing and analysis, it's just out of its league. Here's the second point. Evolution and Christianity can coexist if Christianity will respect science. See, I love science. In fact, I majored in it in my first few years of college, and it should never be looked at being at cross purposes with God. Science runs on a track of reliable and predictable laws, and these laws have resulted in so many medical and technological advances. In fact, we ought to praise science. And while the Bible is not a book of science, because after all, that's not its intention, you see science running through it all the time, and when you do, there's generally never a conflict. In fact, there's a group of scientists, men and women of faith, who call themselves theistic evolutionists. They believe God was very involved in creation and that he used science to keep the process moving and developing. Now, I'm not saying I agree with all they say, but what I am saying is that there's a lot of overlap with evolution and faith, and they can work together if each will stay in their own lane. And here's the third point. Evolution and Christianity cannot coexist if evolution removes God in the name of science. You see, science for centuries didn't see itself at cross purposes with God, but simply working with God to put definition to what he was doing. It wasn't anti-God at all. And God is certainly not anti-science. In fact, he loves it. The orderliness of science is a reflection of who he is, and it's wonderful. But in the early 20th century, a group of atheists determined that they needed to use science to disprove God, especially in the area of education. Now, one of these was a guy by the name of John Dewey. You may have heard of him. He's known as the father of American education, and he was a devout atheist. And he wanted to make sure to get the theory of evolution into the teaching of science, not so much because it was proven science, but as a scientific way to eliminate God. If this is how the conversation had gone, about this time I'd probably say something like, so you see, the two don't really have to be in conflict with one another. Of course they can if people dig in their heels. But you may not understand what the whole purpose of Jesus is in all this, how he wants to connect us into a very real relationship with God. And if you have a few minutes, I'd love to show you how that works. You have to remember that answering questions and arguing won't introduce anybody to Christ. Having a science background, I could have given a dozen more answers, but I stopped right there because those points wouldn't do what only the gospel can do. And that's introduce somebody into a relationship with God that will change them today, tomorrow, and forever.